Long before the police arrived at the house on Sandringham Road, long before courtrooms and news headlines, Emily Longley's story was already unfolding quietly. She grew up in Banbury, Oxfordshire, with her parents, Nikki and David Longley. Emily was a thoughtful, gentle teenager, close to her family, caring toward her friends, curious about the world, and looking forward to the independence that comes with growing up. She loved animals. She talked about college, jobs, her future. She was starting to imagine a life that belonged to her. It was during her school years that she met Elliot Turner. At first, it seemed like a normal teenage relationship, two kids spending time together, texting all the time, figuring out first love. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing seemed off. But slowly, things began to change. Friends would later say that Elliot became possessive. He wanted to know where Emily was at all times. He questioned who she talked to, got upset when she spent time away from him. What might have seemed like attention at first turned into control. Emily began to pull away. Testimony in court later described how Elliot monitored her phone and social media. He demanded explanations for messages, reacted angrily to conversations he didn't approve of. Arguments became constant. The tension never really went away. It stopped being about love. It became about control. Emily tried to end the relationship more than once. Every attempt was met with resistance, emotional pressure, manipulation. Elliot threatened to hurt himself if she left. He made her feel responsible for his well-being. He refused to respect her decision. Leaving wasn't as simple as walking out the door. Like many people caught in coercive control, she got trapped in a cycle: fear, guilt, reassurance, temporary calm, and then another round of pressure. It wore her down. She felt responsible for his feelings. She worried about what he might do. She told people she was scared. By early 2013, the situation had gotten serious enough for the authorities to step in. Police were called after Elliot made threats of violence and self-harm. Officers went to see him. His behavior was logged. The seriousness of his fixation on Emily was noted. But that intervention didn't go any further. No one was arrested. No restraining order was put in place. Nothing officially kept Emily and Elliot apart. From the outside, it was clear the situation was serious. From the system's perspective, though, there wasn't enough to act on. Emily tried to move forward. She talked about college. She worked on rebuilding friendships. She tried to put distance between herself and Elliot. But he stayed present, calling, texting, showing up, refusing to let go of control he no longer had the right to exercise. Court records later showed that Elliot's behavior grew more intense as he realized Emily might be slipping away for good. Rejection wasn't something he could accept. This wasn't just a teenage breakup anymore. It had turned into an obsession. In the months leading up to May 2013, Emily's parents noticed how anxious she had become. Nikki and David Longley later described how emotionally drained she seemed, carrying a burden she couldn't fully explain. She was trying to be brave. She was trying to handle it herself. Like many young people in controlling relationships, she didn't fully grasp how dangerous things had become. Then came a decision that would change everything. In early May, Emily agreed to travel to Bournemouth to see Elliot one last time. Her family says she hoped the visit would bring closure, that a final conversation might calm him down and let her move on without fear. It wasn't an unusual hope. Many people in controlling relationships believe they can negotiate peace. Emily packed a small bag and left Banbury. She never came home. She arrived in Bournemouth carrying months of fear, pressure, and unfinished conversations. Her plan was to stay briefly with Elliot and his parents, Lee and Anita Turner. She told those close to her that the visit was meant to be the last step, an attempt to end things calmly, to resolve the tension, and to move forward with her life. It was a choice made with hope, and it would cost her life. Inside the Turner household, things were already tense. Court evidence later showed that Elliot hadn't accepted the end of the relationship. In the weeks leading up to Emily's visit, his messages revealed anger, obsession, and a refusal to let go. Friends would later describe him as unpredictable, swinging between pleading and aggression. By the evening of May 6, 2013, Emily was inside the house on Sandringham Road. What happened next happened behind closed doors, but investigators were able to piece together the timeline through phone records, forensic evidence, and witness testimony. At some point that night, an argument broke out between Emily and Elliot. According to the prosecution, this wasn't a sudden fight that escalated on its own. It was the result of months of control, tension, and resentment. Elliot couldn't accept Emily's independence. He couldn't handle rejection. And when it became clear she was leaving him for good, his anger turned violent. Emily was stabbed repeatedly. Pathologists later testified that the wounds were deliberate and forceful. It wasn't a single moment of loss of control. It was sustained. The attack continued until she collapsed. She died in that bedroom. What happened afterward would prove just as important as the attack itself. Instead of immediately calling for help, Elliot's parents became involved. Time passed. When the emergency call finally came in the early hours of May 7th, the story given to paramedics was vague and misleading. It suggested confusion, panic, people unsure of what had happened. Medical staff quickly saw the reality. Emily's injuries were too severe. She had lost too much blood. There was no chance of saving her. And the scene didn't match the story. Detectives noticed inconsistencies almost right away. Blood patterns didn't match the claim that Emily had harmed herself. Signs of attempted cleanup suggested someone had interfered. Timelines didn't line up. The delay in calling for help immediately raised suspicion. Officers realized this wasn't a tragic accident or a sudden emergency. It was a murder, followed by a lie. Elliot Turner was arrested later that day. So were his parents. News that a teenage girl from Banbury had been killed in Bournemouth spread quickly. For Emily's family, the confirmation didn't come from rumors or headlines. It came from police officers at their door, bringing news that would change their lives forever. Nikki and David Longley later spoke about those first hours. The disbelief, the unanswered questions, the shock of realizing their daughter, who had been scared, who had reached out for help, was gone. What they didn't know yet was how much evidence already existed, showing a pattern that should have been impossible to ignore. A relationship built on control, warnings that had been reported but not acted on, and a final meeting that should never have happened. As investigators reconstructed Emily's last hours, one thing became clear. This wasn't a single, isolated moment of violence. It was the predictable outcome of a relationship that had been dangerous for months. The case would soon move from the crime scene to the courtroom, where every message, every missed warning, and every choice would be examined. At the house on Sandringham Road, detectives began the slow, careful work of reconstruction. It wasn't just about what happened the night Emily died. It was about everything that led up to it. In the bedroom where she was found, forensic officers documented blood patterns, knife wounds, and signs that the scene had been disturbed. The blood showed she had been attacked where she fell. There was no accident, no evidence she had hurt herself. The wounds told the story clearly. Pathologists later confirmed that Emily had been stabbed multiple times with force in vital areas. The injuries weren't a single impulsive act. They showed sustained violence. This wasn't panic. It was intent. One of the most troubling details was the delay. Investigators determined Emily had been stabbed late on May 6, 2013, but emergency services weren't called until the early hours of the next morning. Those hours became central to the prosecution's case. Phone records showed activity after the attack. Statements from inside the house were inconsistent, and there were signs someone had tried to interfere with the scene. Detectives quickly realized this wasn't confusion or panic. It was a deliberate choice to avoid scrutiny. The story told by Lee and Anita Turner began to fall apart. As investigators dug deeper, they turned to Emily's phone. What they found was devastating. Messages between Emily and Elliot showed a relationship controlled by pressure and fear. Texts revealed Elliot demanding constant reassurance, reacting with anger to perceived slights, and refusing to accept that it was over. The volume and intensity of his messages made the obsession clear. Emily's messages, in contrast, revealed exhaustion and fear. She tried to calm him. She tried to put distance between them without triggering more conflict. She tried to end things gently, afraid of what might happen if she didn't. To investigators, it became clear that Emily's trip to Bournemouth wasn't about reconciliation. It was a last attempt to get away. Friends and family spoke to police. They described her anxiety, her careful attempts not to upset Elliot, and her fear about how he might react if she fully ended the relationship. Several confirmed that Emily had told them she felt trapped. Police records supported these accounts. Back in January 2013, officers had already been called when Elliot made threats involving self-harm and violence. The incident was documented, but no further action was taken. The warning signs had been there, they just hadn't been acted on. As the investigation continued, one conclusion became unavoidable. Emily's death was not sudden or unforeseeable. It was the predictable result of a relationship that had been spiraling toward violence for months. Detectives built their case around that reality. Elliot Turner was charged with murder. His parents were later charged with perverting the course of justice, accused of deliberately misleading police in the hours after Emily's death. When the case went to court, it wasn't about emotion or speculation anymore. It was about evidence, clear, detailed, and impossible to ignore. As the trial approached, Emily's parents faced a painful new reality, not just losing their daughter, but having her final months examined publicly. Every message she had sent, every fear she had voiced, every careful step she had taken to try to leave safely. For Nikki and David Longley, the investigation confirmed what they had already begun to believe. Emily had done everything she could. The system hadn't, and the courtroom would soon decide who was responsible, not just for her death, but for everything that led to it. When the case reached Winchester Crown Court in 2014, the courtroom became the place where months of fear, control, and missed warnings were finally spoken out loud. For Nikki and David, it was the first time they would hear, in full, what their daughter had gone through in her final hours. For the public, it revealed that what seemed like a private teenage relationship had been far more dangerous. At the center of it all sat Elliot Turner, then 20 years old. He didn't deny being with Emily on the night she died. What he denied was responsibility. Prosecutors laid out a clear, methodical case, built on evidence, not speculation. The Crown argued that Elliot had been obsessed with Emily and enraged by her attempts to end the relationship. Her independence, they said, was something he could not accept. Jurors were shown text messages from the weeks and months leading up to her death. Messages where Elliot demanded constant reassurance. Messages where he accused Emily of betraying him. Messages that revealed a fixation so intense it verged on desperation. Prosecutors described the final meeting in Bournemouth not as a reconciliation, but as a breaking point. Emily had gone there to end things for good. Elliot had come face to face with rejection. The Crown argued that what followed wasn't a momentary loss of control. It was a deliberate, sustained attack. Pathologists took the stand. They explained that Emily had been stabbed multiple times with force in vital areas. The injuries showed intent. It wasn't a single impulsive act. The violence continued until it was fatal. Emily had no chance. The defense tried to argue that Elliot hadn't intended to kill her, that the events had been chaotic, emotional, and unplanned. They painted a picture of a volatile argument, a loss of control, a tragic escalation. But the evidence made that hard to believe. The number of wounds, their placement, and the forensic findings left no room for doubt. This wasn't an accident or a brief loss of control. The prosecution highlighted that intent could be seen not just in what happened that night, but in the pattern of behavior leading up to it. Control, obsession, escalation. The jury was asked to decide whether Emily's death was truly unpredictable, or whether it was the inevitable result of a relationship built on fear and domination. As the case against Elliot unfolded, attention turned to his parents, Lee and Anita Turner. Their actions in the hours after Emily's death became a trial of their own. The jury heard that emergency services weren't called right away, that misleading statements were made, that attempts were taken to shield Elliot from responsibility. Blood evidence contradicted their version of events. Timelines didn't add up. Explanations fell apart under forensic scrutiny. Prosecutors accused them of putting loyalty to their son above the life of a dying teenager. It was a devastating claim, and one the jury would later accept. After weeks of testimony, the jury went to deliberate. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Elliot Turner was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 16 years, a reflection of the severity of the crime and the sustained nature of the attack. Later, in a separate trial, Lee and Anita Turner were convicted of perverting the course of justice. Both received prison sentences for their roles in trying to mislead investigators after Emily's death. For Emily's family, the verdicts brought accountability, but not closure. As the sentences were handed down, Nikki and David Longley sat through details no parent should ever have to hear. Their daughter's final moments, her fear, the choices that had led her to Bournemouth. Nikki later spoke about the unbearable weight of knowing that Emily had done everything she could to escape, and that the system had failed to protect her in time. The trial did more than determine guilt. It exposed how controlling behavior can be overlooked, how emotional abuse can be minimized, and how dangerous the gap can be between warning signs and action. When the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, one thing remained clear. Emily Longley's death wasn't just about a single violent act. It was the result of a pattern: control, obsession, and warning signs that were seen too late or dismissed too easily. And outside the courtroom, her parents were already asking a new question. What could be done to stop someone else from becoming the next Emily? When the courtroom doors closed and the sentences were handed down, the legal process ended, but the impact of Emily's death didn't. For Nikki and David Longley, life was divided into a before and an after. Their daughter's name had become tied to a case that revealed uncomfortable truths about teenage relationships, coercive control, and missed intervention. The convictions brought a measure of justice, but not peace. They were left with a question that would never go away. How did so many warning signs fail to stop this? Rather than retreat from public view, the Longleys made a decision that would shape Emily's legacy. They spoke. They talked openly about Emily's fear, about the control she lived under, about how difficult it was for a teenager to be taken seriously when abuse didn't leave visible marks. In interviews with BBC Breakfast and national newspapers, Nikki Longley described how Emily had tried to manage Elliot's behavior carefully, worried that rejecting him outright could make things worse. David Longley spoke about the frustration of realizing, in hindsight, just how much responsibility had been placed on a young girl to keep herself safe. Their message was clear. This wasn't just about one violent act. It was about a system that struggled to recognize danger in time. Emily's case became part of a wider conversation in the UK. Media coverage in The Guardian and BBC News highlighted coercive control, a form of abuse that relies on fear, manipulation, and domination rather than physical violence. At the time of Emily's death, this kind of behavior was still poorly understood, especially in teenage relationships. Experts pointed out that many of the warning signs in Emily's case, constant monitoring, emotional threats, isolation, were often dismissed as immaturity or relationship drama. Emily's story challenged that thinking. Her death became a case study for educators, charities, and domestic abuse organizations, showing how emotional abuse can escalate into lethal violence. Police had been aware of Elliot Turner's behavior months before Emily's death. Threats had been made, fear had been expressed, yet no restraining order was issued, and no long-term safeguarding measures were put in place. Domestic abuse advocates pointed out that Emily's case highlighted a gap between recognizing risk and taking decisive action, especially when the victim is young. It wasn't about blame, it was about learning. In the years that followed, Emily's parents worked with schools and advocacy groups to teach young people about healthy relationships. But questions still linger. How many young people are told they're responsible for managing someone else's emotions? How many warning signs are dismissed until it's too late? How many teens are still told what they're experiencing is normal? Emily Longley did not disappear quietly. Her life and her death forced a reckoning, and while nothing could undo what happened at that house on Sandringham Road, her story ensured that the dangers of control, obsession, and emotional abuse would no longer be so easily ignored. Years after her death, the legal facts are clear. The verdicts were reached, the sentences were handed down. Responsibility, in a legal sense, was assigned. But the story doesn't end cleanly. Emily was not invisible. She told people she was afraid. She tried to end a controlling relationship. Police were aware of concerning behavior months before she was killed. Those facts are not disputed. What remains unresolved is how those warnings were interpreted and why they weren't enough to trigger stronger protection. Emily's case sits in a gray area that systems often struggle with: emotional abuse without immediate physical violence, and young people rather than adults. At the time, coercive control wasn't yet fully recognized in law the way it is today. But the danger was real. Emily's final decision to meet Elliot one last time has been scrutinized again and again. Why did she go? Those who knew her best have said the answer was simple and tragic. Emily wanted peace. She believed that if she handled things carefully enough, if she said the right words in the right way, the threat would fade. It's a belief many victims share. And it places an unbearable burden on the person most at risk. The case also raises hard questions about responsibility beyond the killer. What role should adults play when warning signs are clear? What happens when parents protect their child at the expense of the truth? And how should authorities respond when threats are made, but violence hasn't yet happened? The convictions of Lee and Anita Turner highlighted one painful reality. When loyalty comes before honesty, it can make harm worse rather than prevent it. Emily didn't just lose her life, she lost time that might have mattered. Since her death, awareness around coercive control has grown. Laws have changed, education has improved. But cases like Emily's still happen, reminding us that recognition alone isn't enough to prevent tragedy. That gap remains. Emily Longley's story endures not because of how it ended, but because of what it reveals. That control can hide as care. That danger can build quietly. That young voices are too often underestimated. Her parents have said that if Emily's story can stop even one person from ignoring a warning sign, then her death will not have been in vain. And that is the legacy she leaves behind. Thank you for watching Murder Ledger. We explore real cases, unanswered questions, and the details that refuse to fade. If these stories matter to you, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments.